Conversation with a Geographer. I'm Mike DeVivo, professor of geography at Grand Rapids Community College, and today we're very fortunate to have Sarah Elwood, professor of geography and chair of the geography department at the University of Washington in Seattle. Sarah, thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
You know, as I normally start these conversations, I like to ask you to reflect upon how you got into geography. Maybe there were times in your childhood you didn't realize you were going to become a geographer, but in recalling some of those incidents, some of those episodes, maybe you have, or maybe it was a time in high school or as an undergraduate. Would you like to comment on that?
Sure. Like so many people who sort of were schooled in the 70s and 80s in the US, I'm the social studies generation. Geography as such was not part of my education. And so, I had no idea that I would be a geography major as an undergrad. But as I think about some of the things that were interesting to me that were sort of fundamental to experiences in the places that I lived growing up, I can see some of those seeds. So, I was a teenager, young adult in Western Oregon in the 1980s, in sort of the crash of the timber industry that so defines the region, or certainly did in those days. And, I think that kind of intersection of people and place, human and environment, kind of sparked a bunch of questions about, as my colleague Michael Brown calls it, the why of where. So I think I was preconditioned to show up at Macalester College in 1990, take a geography course and sort of say, this helps me make sense of the world.
Well, that's certainly intriguing, because at that time there was certainly a battle between the conservationists and even the preservationists, as well as those who were very much involved in resource exploitation, I think, throughout the entire state of Oregon. There were a number of lumbermen and employees in the lumber industry that saw their family's legacy really threatened. But by the same token, you did see state government and federal government step in and manage those forest lands, essentially, for a number of reasons, one of which was for water resource management, as you well know. But then you went to Macalester, and talk about your experience at Macalester.
Yeah, to sort of loop around, absolutely. You described the conflicts that were happening in Oregon at the time. My dad works in forestry extension and, was before that worked in the Forest Service, fought fire out west. My first job, other than sort of picking fruits and vegetables, which everybody in that region does, I think, as a teen, my first job was working for the Forest Service. And so, being in little communities that were being devastated by some of these changes and trying to navigate those tensions was really formative. So I show up at Macalester in 1990 thinking, I don't know why, that I want to major in anthropology, which, I don't know, maybe I'd heard about it. I took an intro to human geography class, and, that was that. Like so many of us who passed through Macalester at that time, I took Dave Lanegren's urban geography class, which sort of was a famous experience among geography undergrads at Macalester.
A stellar geographer, for sure.
Yep. And so was also then fairly quickly took, I was trained right at that transition from sort of manual cartography to digital cartography to early GIS. So my courses at Macalester covered all of those, X-Acto knives and Zipatone and wax to put the labels on into sort of early GIS software. And so I was employed as an undergraduate preceptor, a sort of TA, and then on some research projects with the GIS and cartography skills. But then my coursework, because Macalester had almost no requirements in sort of for distribution outside of your major at the time, which really allowed me a ton of flexibility to make up this eclectic sort of program of study that went from anthropology to sort of computer programming, human geography to cartography. I think I took an environmental econ class, some philosophy and religious studies. The first gay and lesbian studies course at Macalester was offered in fall of 92. I was in that, maybe fall of 91, anyway. And then late in my time there, I'd more or less taken everything that I could. Jerry Pitzel had the flexibility and willingness to supervise an independent study where I went over to the geography section of the bookstore and bought Gillian Rose's Feminism and Geography, Variations on a Theme Park, a whole bunch of Dave Harvey's Social Justice in the City, and sort of sat down over the course of spring of my senior year to read those texts.
Wonderful.
I understood almost nothing of what I read at the time in ways that you grow into understanding for your career.
For those viewers that aren't familiar with Macalester, I think it's fair to say that Macalester, Middlebury, and Dartmouth probably have the premier liberal arts programs in geography in the U.S. today, as far as those liberal arts colleges go.
Yeah, and so it was just pure happenstance that I ended up there. I mean, not pure happenstance. My family is from Western Illinois. My folks were living in the upper Midwest when I was a kid. And so, as a 17-year-old contemplating moving to a whole new place, at least I remembered having lived in the Twin Cities as a child. And so somehow that seemed possible in a way.
And so from Macalester, you then went on to graduate school?
Yeah, I sometimes feel like do as I say, not as I do. I sometimes feel like going directly on from undergrad to grad sometimes isn't the best thing for all folks, but I did it, worked out okay. I came to a kind of life crossroads where at that T-junction, it was, am I going to grad school in geography? Or am I going to seminary and into ordained ministry? Now, at that time in the struggles of the United Methodist Church, I was far enough out of the closet that it quickly became clear that the latter was not going to be an option. And so, off I went to grad school at Minnesota, which again, I contemplated going to some other places, but when a terrific grad program is just across the river, off you go. I was just with some of those faculty and many generations of Minnesota geography alum last weekend, and it reminded me what a magic time it was there.
You certainly had an abundance of resources right at your footsteps, at your fingertips. You were able to do so much and engage in dialogue with stellar faculty, not only in geography, if you wish, but in other departments as well. Comment on some of the faculty that you became engaged with.
Yeah, Helga Leitner was my doctoral advisor, Eric Shepard on the committee, also Bob McMaster. And so, that trio, you sort of see the sort of breadth and depth of perspectives across geography and subdisciplines that's part of that committee. Sort of the political economic analyses, the urban geography bent with a deep commitment to kind of local community action, the sort of GIS and society sub-area that was just beginning to sort of become in my grad school days. And the thing that was really formative about those three at that time, for many of us, was their willingness to come together and grow with us. I don't think, Helga and Eric respectively, the stuff that I was most interested was not primary to them. And they have always been open to kind of growing, learning with their doctoral students in ways that I think mark just not all of us, but then the discipline as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, as I contemplate your history and your time at Minnesota, my thought is, you really did come along at an interesting time in the history of our discipline, because there was seemingly a transition of sorts from this paradigm associated with geographic information science to one associated with social justice, which you blended really in your research as a doctoral student in many ways, it seems, as you look at empowerment and geographic information technologies.
Yeah, John Pickles' edited volume Ground Truth came out my first year in grad school.
Mm-hmm.
It was read by the longstanding Minnesota Geography Reading Group, which includes faculty and grad students. And I think so for me at this crucial moment, it seemed common sense to trouble some of the boundaries that geography has sort of set up in spite of ourselves. And so, that department, like so many, has its sort of quant-qual divide and sort of struggles around some of those epistemological fights that are old in geography. But there was a critical mass of folks that were trying to trouble some of those boundaries. And at the same time, there's this moment in which this technology that was kind of by the experts, for the experts, sort of in conventions of power and domination, was being taken up in new ways by community organizations, neighborhood groups, and also in the city of Minneapolis, there was this big watershed transition inverting the usual lines of planning and sort of fiscal structures underlying community planning. So I think also we can't separate some of my interests in that time that have endured from the neighborhood revitalization program and what it was kind of modeling for the future of urban politics and sort of control by local residents, building a future that would, make for community well-being for people already there.
Sure. Well, and again, the Minnesota Department of Geography had a history also of engaging in collaborations with other departments and colleges on the campus. For example, with the Humphrey School of Public Affairs, there was a very strong geographical presence with Adams for some time. Mm-hmm. And those dialogues tended to be long-lasting, and those are just some ways in which geography was able to exert its presence and its relevance, really, across the campus.
Yeah, as I think about sort of some of those fingerprints on my trajectory, one of my external committee members was Will Craig, who was the longtime, I think, a graduate of the Humphrey School, possibly of geography. Forgive me, Will, I can't remember. He was the director of something called the Center for Urban and Regional Affairs, situated, in collaboration with geography, the Humphrey School, many others. Many of us in my cohort years trained with Jennifer Pierce, who was a professor of sociology, now a longtime professor of American Studies at DeVivo. Tons of connections with what became global studies. Many of my colleagues were in a MacArthur-funded program that broadly was like critical political economies of development. So yeah, the kind of, I think given those deep sort of ecosystems of connection, it's not surprising that many of us have gone on to imagine geography in deep collaboration with, rather than some of the kind of boundary making, gatekeeping that sometimes constrains who we can be as a discipline.
Absolutely. There are difficulties that many departments have faced with that regard, but we're living in a time when we must, I believe, increase our presence throughout our institutions wherever we are able to.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think given that geography as a discipline is oftentimes not understood by administrators from other backgrounds or sort of disciplinary histories, and geography is not seen as essentially necessary and a defining part of an American university. Like, that's not true in other parts of the world, but I think in the US, it means, like, it shapes a certain disciplinary insecurity that sometimes prompts us to do things that I think aren't healthy. But in the best of all worlds, I think as geographers, as departments of geography, it's a really good move to make ourselves intellectually, pedagogically essential.
Oh, absolutely.
To our campuses.
No question. And that absence of understanding that administrative leaders and colleagues in other fields have with regard to geography and what it can contribute to society and what it can contribute to the academy is really a tragedy that we must overcome.
Absolutely. I was once in a meeting where an administrator said, well, in this context, I don't think you have to make the case for geography. And my immediate response was, we always need to make the case for geography. That is in our interest. No, I don't mean that we need to be disciplinary gatekeepers in the sense of insisting that what makes a geographer is a degree in geography. Like, I think we want to be really careful about that, given what we know about the racial disparities in sort of which universities have geography departments or not, and the ways that that is linked to colonialism, white supremacy, some of the present histories of domination and violence that our discipline is wrapped up in. Like, we got to be careful about how we define who is a geographer so that we are opening ourselves to a diversity of ways of doing spatial thinking.
Absolutely. And it's a difficult task. And who is going to give their imprimatur on determining who a geographer might happen to be? That's also a question that should be raised because, a geographer also might be in the eyes of a beholder. And it depends then, too, on the particular position and the particular department and the role one might play in academe or outside academe.
I always say a geographer is anyone who tells us that they are, because, fundamentally, I do believe that there's politics to self-identification. But also, if someone has thoughtfully considered why this frame as an organizing logic for research, for community practice, if they want to be with us, I say, why not?
Why not? Let's move on to where you went from Minnesota now. Where did you go next? Did you go to Chicago?
Yes, in fact, I did. My first job was as on the faculty in geography at DePaul University, which was an utterly fantastic place to start my career. It really, I mean, didn't imagine that I would leave. And the kind of student focus, kind of social justice orientation to so much of the university mission, the commitment to urban education, even as some of that at DePaul is kind of a guilty conscience about the university's role in the gentrification that displaced Lincoln Park's Puerto Rican community to Humboldt Park. There's some challenging histories there that inform why the university does what it does. But nonetheless, there's a lot of positive, kind of positively transformative impulses there. So I was 4 years at DePaul and then had an opportunity to go to the University of Arizona.
Let me interrupt you just for a moment with regard to DePaul, because DePaul has an extraordinary undergraduate program in geography. I see the students' presentations at regional AAG meetings and at the national meeting, and they are truly excellent. They've done a great job at DePaul in terms of collaborating with other departments and building the department and producing good students. I think it's important that we make these assertions that are valid, because it shows that geography is a striking, enchanting, and viable discipline.
Absolutely. There was a time in sort of the late 90s that geography at DePaul might have withered away. There was a massive generational transition, retiring of very senior faculty. And my colleague, Alex Papadopoulos, who was the chair that hired me, informed me in so many ways. Alex just refused to let it happen and did the extraordinarily hard work over many years of hiring the generation that then anchored what this department has become. There's been some terrific leaders of that department, and sort of also kind of a robust faculty commitment to that really intensive undergraduate education that builds students for all kinds of futures. I think Maureen Seo, who teaches in geography, but then also attracts a lot of students from international studies, poli-sci. I mean, is just doing really rigorous, kind of life-changing education with undergrads. Wynn Curran, much the same. There's so many names of folks that are doing fantastic stuff there.
Absolutely. But then you went to Tucson.
Yep. Again, it was an exciting time to be at the University of Arizona. J.P. Jones had just taken over as chair. It was a moment when they were trying to build and expand their GIS program in sort of conversation with human geography. So Kieran Bailey and I were hired together to do some of that. So many of the faculty there were really fundamental in me sort of getting the next step as a researcher, as a writer. There was things that I was writing and working on there that were really pivotal growth moments. As with DePaul, never imagined leaving. It was a time in sort of the history of gay and lesbian family law in this country in which I could not provide health insurance to my partner. And in her line of work, she's direct service provision in mental health care in Arizona, that probably is still not a sort of line of work that comes with secure benefits. And so, we had, coming from the upper Midwest, we had not imagined that that would be the case for her kind of work. And we were in a really vulnerable position. Nothing truly life-changingly catastrophic happened, but, the state was already didn't allow benefits to be conferred and was working on a constitutional amendment to make them unconstitutional. And so, there was a ticking clock on her health insurance. We were paying thousands of dollars to keep her in health insurance. We had to go, geography marks our paths as geographers, both in the substance of what we do and then where we go. When the opportunity to apply at Washington came, my first thought was, oh my God, we just moved less than a year ago. This is impossible. And secondly, I could, through the University of Washington at the time, we could insure her. And we are vulnerable enough that I think I've got to do this. It killed all of us in the department at the time. If my colleagues could have done something, they would have. But these structures at the time were bigger than all of us.
Certainly, it's interesting how those external forces can affect one's individual future, how politics at the state level, and we see that in Florida today. Apparently, the Chronicle of Higher Education has articles about how faculty are choosing not to go to Florida and elsewhere because of the political stances that are being taken and the movements to really disenfranchise people from society.
Yeah, as I think about the weakening of tenure protections, the impulses in some states to make it possible to remove faculty for unpopular views, or ones that run against whoever happens to be in power in the state, I'm not surprised that is shaping faculty choices. Research is not always uncontroversial, and indeed, research that challenges an oppressive status quo, by definition, rocks the boat. That's what we do.
Well, it's part of the job description.
Yeah.
We should make people uncomfortable with regard to some of our findings. We should not be comfortable with regard to the efforts associated with disempowering people across the globe with regard to poverty, some of the things that you've been involved in. We should be willing to address these issues and to attempt to ameliorate these circumstances, at least mitigate some of the damage that's been taking place.
Absolutely. When Vicki Lawson and I started the thinking that eventually led us to form the Relational Poverty Network, that work started from a really counter-normative claim that impoverishment is fundamentally about power and privilege, not about, as sort of the poverty industry, in the US and other rich countries would tell us, it's, those institutions want to make it about impoverished people and places, sort of deficiencies, characteristics of measurements, et cetera. Starting the room as scholars and activists to start from counter-normative claims is essential.
Absolutely. So you're at UW and you find yourself in pretty comfortable academic surroundings, I assume.
It's, I have loved all of the places that I have been. And as I'm wrapping up this term as chair, I'm involved in a bunch of different things, both in our department and then for other people's departments that remind me of all the reasons why I love this environment. It is wonderfully, there are geographers and spatial thinkers spread all over the Seattle campus, and then the additional campuses in Tacoma and Bothell. And so it's an exciting moment. We're doing a bunch of hiring in across the social sciences. I think that faculty hiring is always an exciting moment of transition. And so, yeah, it's just fantastic to see sort of the breadth of possibilities, from things like the Center for Indigenous Studies, the graduate certificate in Indigenous Studies that some of my colleagues have been deeply engaged in founding, to sort of interdisciplinary arts and sciences up at Bothell, where there's a number of fantastic community engaged projects happening. We've got a Center for the Humanities called the Simpson Center that is so open to humanistic social scientists. That's really been a creative hearth for so many of us to build bridges within and beyond geography, kind of in our time at UW.
That is wonderful, and it shows that in many ways your department, by being able to be involved in all of these areas, can really, in some ways, serve as a model for other departments who might have similar opportunities but don't recognize them as opportunities. Oftentimes departments look at these other programs that erupt on campus without their involvement as challenges, as threats. And as we were discussing before, I think it's up to us to go ahead and join in those efforts and exert a strong presence,
Absolutely. I mean, I think a thing that was said to me by senior colleagues, and they said it because their senior colleagues said it to them early in their career, and I say it now to our early career colleagues: your success is our success.
Absolutely.
And, meaning to communicate a broad openness to a whole bunch of things. The most exciting, the best curriculum for our Department of Geography is the curriculum the faculty are most excited to teach, because that's what the students are going to be excited to take.
Absolutely.
As majors and beyond. The best research identity for our department is the research identity that gets us all up every day, coming back in and doing the work in our scholarship and in the communities that support and give rise to the work, the questions we ask, the answers we're forming. That I want us to be a yes and sort of a department rather than a no but kind of a department. I think it matters for all kinds of academia in the sort of austerity generation that has sort of created all kinds of pressures on universities. Those are real. We've got to work with that. Those sort of fiscal pressures, the political pressures, but retaining a sense, not becoming mired in that, but retaining a sense of possibility, of excitement about the futures that we're teaching and researching for. That's going to take us where I think we need to go.
Absolutely. I mean, those are important things to remember, for sure. With about a minute to go here, I'm going to ask you to reflect upon your career, where you've been, where you think you're going to be going, and perhaps offer some words of advice that you might continue to give to students or colleagues, students that might be aspiring undergraduates or graduate students in geography. What sort of counsel might you offer?
Oof, in 1 minute, that's hard. I think
all right, take two.
Sort of ask the hard questions, do the hard work, build and sustain affirmative, generative relationships around all of that to co-investigators to communities, to land and people and place. That is, as I think about it, a fundamentally sort of transformative geographical frame for being, right?
Wow.
Our students don't go to sort of the classified ads, Craigslist, jobs.com, looking for job titles that say geographer. And so thinking about how this sort of relational commitment to being in positive relation with people, place, land, thinking about what that means for them and how their skills and passions and excitements translate to a variety of different paths after they graduate. That's something that as educators in geography, we're going to be doing over and over and over again. That's part of what's fantastic about this work and sort of setting up our students to translate those things into life and work beyond their time with us. That's our biggest challenge. It's such a gift. It grounds differently in different times and places of our career, but that's the work.
It's not just work, I believe. I believe it's really in many ways, and you've emulated it. You've emulated it well. It's a wonderful way of life.
Absolutely.
Sarah, thank you so much for joining us today. It's really been a privilege to have you here for this episode, and I am going to now have to conclude this particular piece of Conversation with a Geographer. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Mike.